Tonight, the history of music played, some say, with a left hand like God. Boogie Woogie.
The late U.B. Blake, ragtime pianist and composer, recalls how in 1896, at the age of 13, he heard the pianist William Turk. He had a left hand like God. He didn't know what key he was playing in, but he played them all. He could play the ragtime stride bass, but it bothered him because his stomach got in the way of his arm. So he used a walking bass instead. We called it 16. They call it Boogie Woogie now.
Hold yourself. Mess around. Now that's what I'm talking about.
Hello, our special guest from America, Big Joe Duskin, playing Pinetop's Boogie Woogie. Recorded by Clarence Pinetop Smith in December 1928 in Chicago, it was the first time the word Boogie Woogie had appeared on a record label, and with its distinctive bass figures in the left hand, it pioneered a piano style immediately recognizable and much copied. Pinetop Smith made just 8 sides, for which he was paid a total of $100, and although he died tragically young at the age of 24, the victim of a stray bullet in a barroom melee, he and his peers gave to the world not only a new word, but a musical form from which, with a little cosmetic surgery, many fortunes were made. For Boogie Woogie, during the war years in America, became a national craze, a musical hula hoop of often crassly commercial dimensions. Although much of this music was at best mediocre, in its original piano form it produced 3 giants, the big 3 of boogie, Meade Lux Lewis, Albert Ammons, and Pete Johnson, and Big Joe Duskin is their true heir. In tonight's South Bank show, we offer a popular history of a popular music, a music that had real value, both as a form by itself and as a foundation and energizer of other forms like rhythm and blues and country and western. In the final part of our show, we will be staging our own South Bank boogie session, but as with all surveys, we begin by attempting a definition.
Boogie Woogie. Does it come from the soul, the dark soul of Africa, the Hausa boog, the Mandingo booga, both meaning to beat, as in beating a drum, the West African pidgin bogie, B-O-G-I, simply to dance? Or is it fanciful to imagine that the term has emerged from the Indo-European mishmash of New Orleans, clad in the French letters B-O-U-G-E-R, bouger, to move? Does boogie woogie mean to the man in the street, woman in the street, or indeed in this instance on the up platform at Harrow-on-the-Hill station? Boogie woogie?
Pardon?
What does it mean to you?
It doesn't mean anything, I'm sorry.
Boogie Woogie?
Boogie Woogie? Boogie Woogie?
What does Boogie Woogie mean to you?
Boogie Woogie means a great deal to me. It seems to have been with me all my life.
Melvin said I was going to do this bit of the introduction.
When I was a boy, in the early years of the war, I was living in Harrow district and used to catch the train every day to and from school. And at that time, Boogie Woogie was the music that all of us were listening to and attempting to play. On this station in those days, the London North Eastern Railway trains used to come through a few times a day, and that was the one I always liked to catch. I used to catch the steams, we called it. The reason why I liked it was basically because the rhythms of the train going over the points just sounded like Boogie Woogie to me. Boogie Woogie and train music always seemed to go together. I remember some of the records that we bought at that time, records like Streamline Train by Cripple Clarence Lofton and Honky Tonk Train Blues, which was by Meade Lux Lewis. Honky Tonk trains, they say, were trains that used to run down to New Orleans on the Illinois Central line, where one of the cars was just an empty vehicle in which people could dance, and the only piece of furniture was not seats, but a piano. Boogie Woogie largely started in logging camps in South Texas and Louisiana in the United States. All the workers on those camps were black. They used to work 8 hours shift and 8 hours barrel house. 8 hours singing and playing in the very rough and ready saloons that were set up and owned by the logging companies. These would be just a shed, often with only a piano, maybe a simple bar of plank over 2 or 3 barrels, and all the workers would be dancing and playing Boogie Woogie. In 1960, I did meet up with Edwin Buster Pickens, one of the very last of the boogie pianists of the Texas tradition. He told me that he would travel from one logging camp to another, riding the blinds, or the blind baggage cars, as they were called, on the freight trains, or hitching a ride from the conductor on the train. Now, the conductors were used to the logging camp pianists clambering aboard, telling them a few stories, jumping off the train, getting into another logging camp, and playing again for 8 hours barrel house. In this way, the music got around all through Texas, and eventually, of course, out of Texas. Now, when this new form of piano music came from Texas, it moved out towards Louisiana. It was brought by people like George Thomas, an early pianist who was already living in New Orleans by about 1910 and writing New Orleans hopscotch blues, which really has some of the characteristics of the music that we came to know as boogie. Now, exactly how this music developed is still quite a problem for historians. I've got with me Francis Wilford Smith, who's a noted authority on the subject, to discuss this. Francis, how do you think it began?
Well, you were talking about the origins coming from ragtime. I think there's no doubt that it was a development of ragtime. There's an element of white music inevitably in ragtime, and I think it got blacker and blacker as more blacks were able to get their hands on pianos. And I think that there was a need to produce a rhythmic music. And it was George Thomas who made the first recording on which there was a boogie bass was used, a walking bass, and that was the Rocks, which he recorded in 1923.
There were many kinds of left-hand bass figures emerging. They were given different names. There was the Chains, the Rocks, the Fives, which became well-known in Memphis. Most of these were 8 beats to the bar, left-hand figures. But it was also possible to play some boogies in 4/4 time, or even in 6/8.
You had pianists who could have a tremendous left hand, and they could give you that beat and still furnish you with the music in the right hand. Today, you always find a bass player and a drummer helping out the piano player. The left hand's a lost art. But here's the way it was yesterday. First, Clarence Williams, simple style.
So the indications are that the music was taking shape in the first decade or so of this century. Now, why it did is a little difficult to ascertain, but we do know that the pianists were sometimes playing in saloons and bars, and very frequently were for what were called house rent parties. Parties that were put on to pay the rent. You paid maybe 5 cents to go, paid a few cents to the pianist, $1 or $2, and provided a little drink, and he played.
Because many times you played a place where you being the only music had to keep that piano going. So when you got hungry, go ahead and eat. Keep that beat going.
This kind of music came from all over the country. Very, very rapidly it developed regional styles, and we find that the pianists were converging on the north, converging on Chicago. In the early part of the century, a whole new generation of younger pianists was born, people like Sunnyland Slim and Roosevelt Sykes, Little Brother Montgomery, who brought a different kind of emphasis to the music.
Yes, they used the boogie bass figures not as a piano, a special piano party piece. They used it as a dynamic platform over which they sung emotional blues.
Lord, I ain't got no special right-a-down. Lord, I ain't got no special right-a-down. Now it seems like my rider is trying to quit me anyhow.
Boogie was not only a separate music, it was also a part of blues, and it was also a part of vaudeville. And it was this ubiquitousness, the fact that it could fit into jazz and into other kinds of music, that made it universally popular.
With its French and Spanish influence, New Orleans jazz has a distinctive flavor. So too does its boogie woogie. In fact, there are claims that the form originated here.
I would say that Boogie Woogie was the bad little boy of the rag family who wouldn't study. I heard crude beginnings of it in the back streets of New Orleans in those early years following 1904, but they really were back streets. More crude than Pine Top's efforts, such music never got played in the gilded places. New Orleans historian Roy Carew.
The New Orleans style was somewhat different. It had more of a kind of habanero bass, a little bit more accentuated left-hand rhythm.
Yes, this is what they call the Spanish tinge. Jelly Roll Morton talk about the Spanish tinge, and you hear it in these pianists today, and indeed even in the rhythm of some of the sort of Creole words, like two-way, back-away. You get a strange rhythm that is not found in normal black music outside that area.
Although considered the originator of Boogie Woogie in the city, Professor Longhair was actually a second-generation player. His influence was Toots Washington, not well known because not recorded, but inescapably the real source.
Oh, that's what I was saying all the time.
We don't want no papa diddly do pa da diddly da, because if we do, we're gonna cut in on him.
Before Washington and Longhair died, filmmaker Stevenson Palfy had the good sense to stage a classic session at which they were joined by the leading representative of the contemporary New Orleans sound, Alan Toussaint. Pianist Pete Johnson was already a mainstay of the thriving Kansas City jazz scene. With blues shouter Big Joe Turner, they not only fueled the music of that city then, but were a major influence on early rhythm and blues. Johnson's composition, Roll 'em Pete, set the style. Roll 'em without the Pete this time was a key composition of another Kansas City pianist, Mary Lou Williams. She's seen here playing it in Kansas City at her acceptance concert at Rockhurst College, when awarded an honorary degree in music for her contribution over 50 years to American music. The widespread popularity of Boogie Woogie might never have occurred but for the enthusiasm of that foresighted promoter of black music in the 30s and 40s, John Hammond. He'd already discovered Bessie Smith and Billie Holiday, and now Boogie Woogie caught his ear and his attention. Although originally recorded in 1928, Meade Lux Lewis's Honky Tonk Train Blues had sold only moderately as a race record, that is, to blacks only. Hearing it again in 1935, Hammond quickly got Lewis to make a new version of his classic, but could get no American label to issue it. It was the English Parlophone label that obliged. Lewis dropped out of sight again, and it was only after a long search that Hammond found him washing cars in Chicago.
And he made no impact at all. And the whole thing was a disaster. Lewis, nobody was interested, and Lewis went back to Chicago, and a very disappointed man. But it was in 1938 that the second concert, the important one, took place, the Carnegie Hall Spirituals to Swing one.
The concert was reported in both Walter Winchell's nationally syndicated column and in the New York Times.
Albert Ammons, Meade Lux Lewis, and Pete Johnson, all from the West, lived their music. They could barely contain themselves when the music was underway. And what endurance!
The result was unprecedented. Boogie Woogie had become a national craze literally overnight. The newly famous purveyors of this raw piano style were booked into Barney Josephson's new club for the smart set in Greenwich Village, Cafe Society. Boogie Woogie had gone from logging camp to supper club in less than a decade.
Albert Ammons and Pete Johnson, those two terrific pianists, are going to play their original composition called Boogie Woogie Dream. It has always been their greatest desire to play their music to a select society in a cafe like this.
Someone who knew both Ammons and Johnson and who carries on their tradition is Big Joe Duskin. What was your own contact with Ammons and Johnson?
My own contact with him at the time that I had taken a minister to New York, and I asked him to let me run his car. I want to run over and get some music over in New Jersey. I knew that's where Ammons lived. I always wanted to see the guy, and when I got over, I went to a music store, I bought his book, and there was a violinist come in that knew Ammons' name. He says, I see you like Boogie Woogie. He says, go up the street. We go to his home. We goes up the street. Here he comes down, and he's walking down the street. He says, he comes down. So what we done, he introduced me to him, and that's the first time I like to kiss the guy. I'm going to tell you the truth, but man, not funny now, you know, but so glad to see him. And after he introduced me to him, I says, Ammons, I told him this last, I come all the way to Cincinnati. From Cincinnati, just to hear you play a couple of boogies. He says, going right down to a little bar down the street. Come on, we all walk down. But that's where I used to go in and drink a little bit, you know. So he goes in and he sits and he plays this Boogie Woogie stuff. I loved Ammons because he used a lot of sixth and fourth and fifth and that, and he makes it up. And then he do the... I like that because of his tremolo and stuff like that. He could really lay it down when he comes into that.
What about Johnson? Okay,
now, at the time that I met Johnson, we goes back up to New York City, and I found out that Johnson lived in Buffalo. I went to a gas company, I got all the telephone books, and I couldn't find his name in there nowhere. So somebody told me where he lived at in Buffalo. I can't think of the street now. And I'm standing out in front of the house. He gets out the car with some groceries, him and Marge, and they're coming in. So he saw me, he says, can I help you? I said, yes, I'm looking for Pete Johnson. He says, I'm Pete. I like to drop to the ground, you know, right there at this time. So he invited me in the house. I went in and introduced me to Marge. Then he played a couple of songs in there for me. Now, here's the thing that Pete told me. Said, if I could run this bass like this, have a devil of a good left hand, I'd be a good pianist. Ammons and Johnson was the main two that really did influence me, and that's the thing that really got me teed off.
You found it quite hard to get started as a boogie player. Your father objected, didn't he?
Yes, he did. Listen, I loved the old guy, but the old man was a minister. He'd throw you in hell just to look at you if you did wrong. And I'll tell you what he used to do. He used to tell me, don't never play no devil's music in the house, but when he'd go to church, now he'd always carry that umbrella. This morning, he didn't take it. And he's going on the bus. I had kids out watching. He got on the bus and said, hey, that old man's gone. But I'd always play in the key where I could swing it in. Be not dismayed, whatever you do, God will take care of you. So when he was gone, this is the old song I used to do. Then the old man was looking in the window, and I seen him looking, I said, I'm coming in there and take care of you right now. And boy, he did. So I told him one day, I said, Dad, I said, you're going to be beating me every day. I'm going to have to play this stuff. He said, well, why don't you just do this? Come in here. I want to talk with you. And I went in. He says, look, I'm 89 years old. Why don't you just wait till I get in the grave? And after I'm dead and gone, you do what you want to do, and I won't be able to do it. I said, God, that's okay. I said, Dad, I'll do that. And I even went through the service. Went around, couldn't play nothing. When the old man got over 100 years old, I went to Mom and said, hey, this guy gonna live like Methuselah. And she didn't want me to talk about him anyway. I said, God, Mom, I can't even play a note till he's in the grave. I said, look, And so when he got 105, I just threw up both hands. And I never did touch the piano after he was gone until Steve Tracy told me to get it back. He says, hey, why don't you just come with me? He's a good harmonica player. And that's what happened. I got back into it, and that's why I'm playing it now, you know.
Disreputable from the word go, swing's latest and liveliest child has crossed the tracks and become respectable at last. Take a good deep breath, step up, and meet Boogie Woogie. Collier's Magazine, June 24th, 1930.
It's easy to do, call it the Callaway Boogie. Callaway Boogie. Callaway Boogie. Callaway Boogie. Keeps you groovy 24 hours a day.
Suddenly, every swing band in the land had a couple of boogie woogies in their repertoire, the bass and treble parts from the piano transposed to brass and reeds. Will Bradley's band, which boasted the leading white pianist in the idiom, Freddie Slack, built a whole career on them. But like all crazes in popular music, boogie woogie had its share of detractors.
Since it is impossible to explain Boogie Woogie to any decent citizen over the age of 30, it can be recognized only by symptoms. If at the sound of a strange kind of music your offspring begin to twist mysteriously about on one spot, you will have conclusive proof that Boogie Woogie has entered the youthful bloodstream. This particular species of apoplexy has been known to a few connoisseurs around Chicago for years, but it was only at Christmas time last year.
There were musical detractors too, from opposing camps. Fats Waller had it written into his concert contracts that he was not required to play it, considering it cheap and unmusical because of its repetition and limited harmonics. While Aaron Copland, despite having earlier championed the conjunction of jazz and classical forms, wrote of Boogie Woogie of its
lack of any shred of melodic invention.
But Copland's contemporary, Morton Gould, disagreed and argued his case with this piece, Boogie Woogie Etude. Hosea Turby, the respected classical pianist who recorded this piece at the time, was quickly co-opted by Hollywood to accompany Judy Garland in pastiche boogie style.
To hear you get in my groove, I said to hear you get in the groove. You won't believe it, you'll think it's a dream to hear 'em riffing it right on the beam. But when you hear trumpets give out a call, you'll know the joint is really jumping down at Carnegie Hall. Instead of Strauss, they play Irving Berlin. Instead of Brahms, it's begin to begin. Those classic khakis are due for a fold, 'cause the joint is really jumping down at Carnegie Hall. They swing everything with a ding dong, and when the maestro gives them a beat, it's a reed beat that starts them to toot with a root toot. That's a bit of all right, and even Joey Turby's getting hep. He's hep. Boy, Tchaikovsky would really be hurt to hear him jiving his piano concerts. Beethoven's lucky he can't hear at all, 'cause the joint is really jumping. The joint is really jumping. The joint is really jumping, and I mean it's down at Carnegie Hall.
In the torrent of titles that now poured forth, Boogie Woogie, both as a walking bass figure and more often now just as an appendage to a tune title, was grafted onto all kinds of compositions: popular classic, folk tune, big band standard, and standard blues. Not forgetting the inevitable novelty numbers. spread like a bushfire across America, largely through radio.
Benny, the minutes of the meeting say that we're about to have lesson 2 in tonight's educational feature for club members.
Yes, Johnny. We're taking another chapter in the history of Boogie Woogie.
Meade and Albert Ammons and Pine Top Smith lived together, and they had an old upright piano in their room. It was Pine Top Smith who brought to Chicago that great style of blues we call Boogie Woogie. Meade and Ammons listened to him and learned. And when Pine Top died, they carried on.
Well, thanks for that fine chapter resume, Johnny Mercer.
During this time, the big three of Boogie were also being regularly recorded and were making a reasonable living. But their rewards were hardly in line with the lavish livelihoods they enabled others to make. The Bob Crosby Orchestra had had huge hits with 2 Meade Lux Lewis originals, Yancey Special and Honky Tonk Train, without the blues this time. Lewis was asked to attend the recording session. Yet in 1942, with 500,000 copies sold of his own versions of these titles, for nearly a year he was refused membership of ASCAP, a composers' organization that collects and distributes royalties. By ensuring that many standard boogies were written down and published, publishers were also insuring themselves for life, without accidents. The ace annotator being one Frank Paparelli, described as
America's greatest authority on Boogie Woogie.
But for some, even the standard 50% royalty on each tune wasn't enough. John Hammond, one of Boogie Woogie's earliest champions, uncovered a classic case.
I wrote a piece on the business practices of the Decca executives. I told how Jack Kapp had acquired Pine Top's Boogie Woogie and copyrighted the words Boogie Woogie so that any song title using them would have to pay royalty.
As a result of Hammond's pressure, Kapp was cautioned and the coup aborted. Black artists had always known the score, but boogied right on, beating Daddy, or in this case, the man, with the best 8 to the bar in the business. When at the end of World War II the boogie bubble burst, its influence on other music forms was quickly apparent. And soon, guitar boogies were a staple of R&B. Although they had different rhythmic patterns from the piano form, most blues artists featured them. There was a white version too. Standard boogies, just as 10 years before with big bands, were now a part of a country artist's repertoire.
The blues in a different sort of way. He's got no piano for the A to the bar, but he picks out the boogie on his old guitar. He plays the hillbilly boogie in the low-down way. And he can play the boogie, play it for me in the old days.
Shotgun boogie, I done saw your track. Look out, Mr. Rabbit, when I cock my hammer back. Well, over on the ridge is a scaly bark. Hickory nuts so big you can see 'em in the dark. The big fat squirrels, they scratch and they fight. I'll be on that ridge before daylight. Shotgun boogie, I don't need but one shot. Look out, bushy tail, tonight you'll be in the pot.
There was even a late flourish in the 50s by some of these same swing bands. Now more jazz-based than blues-based, Boogie Woogie wouldn't lie down. It was really only with the death of the three piano giants of boogie that the form went into serious decline. Albert Ammons had died in 1949. Pete Johnson was to die in 1965. They'd found work hard to come by. It was a long way from Carnegie Hall to the Circus snack bar. Unhappily, their playing also declined, and in this last TV appearance of Meade Lux Lewis in 1961, he'd fallen victim to the boogie pianist's cardinal sin, playing too fast and rushing his effects. 3 years later, Lewis met a tragic end. Boogie Woogie as a living form remained where it had started, at the center of the blues mainstream in the cities of the South, New Orleans, Kansas City, and Chicago. It was now played by old men for whom it had always been their music, springing from a distinct social and cultural environment. In Europe, however, blown on the breath of rhythm and blues, young men were reinfected with the boogie bug. In Britain, Holland, and especially Germany, a substantial second-hand boogie tradition was growing. Inevitably, those who were serious about it wanted to check the source. The leading German exponent of the style is Axel Swingenberger.
Playing with them is like drinking liquor from the still, you know. It's, you know, it gives you the basics of the meaning of the music, you know. You get a real feeling of security by that, you know.
Classically trained as a pianist. Why did you want to play boogie woogie?
Well, I was about 17 when I first heard a boogie woogie record. This was an old 78 shellac by Pete Johnson, and you know, that got me right from the first minute. You know, that was exactly what I wanted to do, and what got me first was that dynamic, you know, that moving thing. You know, to me there's no hotter piano music than boogie woogie. And I liked the way the melodies were set also, you know. It was very colorful, and with all the rhythmic and rhythmic power and those beautiful melodies, you know, it just got me right away. And so I stopped playing classical music right from the minute and wanted to play boogie woogie, nothing else.
tell somebody who doesn't know much about boogie woogie what they should be looking for in this session?
When people play boogie, the left hand plays constant figures throughout. It's an unvaried figure, virtually. The right hand, then, is free to play in its own time right-hand figures over the left. So you get two patterns. You get one pattern set up with the left hand, and when the pianist gets that going, he's free to think to play with his right hand patterns over the top, and then the two patterns can combine to make third patterns. So there's an immense amount of textural variety in boogie piano playing.